A flight attendant yells at a passenger over a simple seat mix-up. 2 minutes later, she's fired on the spot. What really went down on that plane? And how did it escalate so quickly? Before we start the story, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. A few weeks ago, something unusual happened on a flight from New York to Miami. It started out as a normal boarding process, with passengers getting settled in their seats. Among the crowd was a young woman named Tanya, who was looking forward to the short flight. She had booked her seat in advance, but when she got to her row, she realized there was a problem. Her seat assignment didn't match what was printed on her ticket. The number was correct, but the actual seat wasn't the one she had chosen. Tanya, already a bit annoyed, tried to find the flight attendant. She thought it would be a simple fix, just a quick adjustment of her seat. But when she approached the attendant, the interaction took a turn. The attendant, a woman named Lisa, didn't exactly greet her with the warmth Tanya was hoping for. Instead of offering a solution, Lisa snapped at her. "You should have checked your seat before getting on," Lisa said, her voice sharp. Tanya tried to stay calm and explain the mistake, but Lisa wasn't having it. "Well, you'll have to deal with it," she replied, getting defensive. The situation started to escalate quickly. Tanya remained patient, explaining that it wasn't her fault and that the airline should fix the issue. But Lisa's attitude only grew worse. "I don't have time for this," she muttered. Tanya, feeling the tension rising, asked if she could speak to someone else, maybe a supervisor. That's when things really got heated. Instead of being polite, Lisa raised her voice. "You can't just take whatever seat you want. You should have followed the rules," she yelled, making the entire cabin turn their heads. Passengers began to whisper, some pulling out their phones, sensing something wasn't right. Tanya, still trying to stay composed, asked again to speak to a manager, but Lisa wouldn't let up. She kept shouting, accusing Tanya of causing a scene, even though Tanya had barely raised her voice. It was clear now that this wasn't going to be a simple fix. What Tanya didn't know, though, was that this disagreement was about to spiral into something no one could have predicted. As the argument grew louder, the tension in the cabin was palpable. Several passengers were now openly staring, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Tanya, feeling more embarrassed than anything, tried to keep her cool. She repeated her request to speak to a supervisor, but Lisa only became more irritable. "I don't know what you think this is, but you can't just expect special treatment," she snapped, barely keeping her voice steady. Tanya's calm demeanor started to crack, but she didn't want to make the situation worse by yelling back. She was frustrated, but she knew that losing her temper wouldn't help. The situation was clearly getting out of hand. Tanya asked if she could move to a different seat if the issue couldn't be fixed, but Lisa, now visibly agitated, refused. "No, that's not how this works," she shot back. The flight attendants, who had been walking up and down the aisle moments before, now started to slow down. It was clear that some of them were noticing the escalating argument, but none stepped in to help. Instead, they kept their distance, unsure of how to handle the growing discomfort between Tanya and Lisa. By now, Tanya's patience was wearing thin. She asked again to speak with a supervisor, this time a little firmer. That was the final straw for Lisa. "Fine," she muttered. "I'll get you someone. But don't think you're going to make a scene on my flight." With that, she stormed off to find someone higher up. Tanya watched her leave, hoping that this was the end of it. But deep down, she could feel the tension still simmering. Just as Tanya took a deep breath, trying to prepare herself for the inevitable confrontation with a manager, something unexpected happened. Instead of a supervisor coming to resolve the issue, the door to the cockpit opened, and the airline's ground manager stepped into the cabin, looking directly at Lisa. Tanya's heart raced as she saw the manager walk straight towards the flight attendant. Lisa had no idea what was coming. The ground manager, a middle-aged man named Rick, didn't waste any time. He didn't approach Lisa to hear her side of the story or ask for an explanation. Instead, he stood directly in front of her and said in a firm, no-nonsense tone, "You're done. Pack your things. You're off the flight." Lisa's face drained of color as she froze, caught completely off guard. She opened her mouth to protest, but Rick didn't give her the chance. "This behavior is unacceptable," he continued, his voice cutting through the tension in the air. "You don't get to treat passengers like that, especially over something this minor." Tanya, still in her seat, couldn't believe what she was hearing. She had expected to be caught in the middle of a heated back and forth with a supervisor, but this was something else entirely. She watched as Lisa's eyes widened, her mouth working to form words that never came. The reality of what was happening seemed to hit her all at once, and she slowly turned to grab her bag, a mix of shock and anger in her expression. As Lisa gathered her things, the other passengers couldn't hide their surprise. Some looked at each other, exchanging glances, while others whispered quietly among themselves. No one had expected things to escalate this quickly. The moment was so surreal that even Tanya found herself unsure of how to feel. She hadn't wanted to get anyone fired, but the way Lisa had treated her, yelling and dismissing her concerns, had been unacceptable. Rick turned to the rest of the passengers and spoke with a calm but assertive voice. "We're going to take care of the situation and ensure the flight continues without any further disruptions. Thank you for your patience." The tone of his voice made it clear that the decision had already been made. Lisa, now holding her belongings, walked toward the door of the plane, her face flushed with embarrassment. She didn't even glance back at Tanya or the passengers as she stepped off, her fate sealed. The manager followed her off the plane shortly after, leaving Tanya and the rest of the passengers in stunned silence. The moment the door closed behind Lisa and the manager, a strange calm settled over the cabin. The hum of the plane's engines seemed louder now, almost like it had been amplified by the tension that had just been released. Passengers, who had been on edge a few minutes earlier, began to settle back into their seats. Some exchanged looks, others muttered softly to one another, processing what had just happened. Tanya, still shaken by the turn of events, sat quietly, her hands gripping the armrests. She couldn't believe how quickly everything had escalated. One moment, she was just trying to fix a seating issue, and the next, a flight attendant had been fired in front of an entire plane full of people. It felt surreal. Tanya glanced out the window, her mind racing. She hadn't wanted to cause a scene, but when she thought about how she'd been treated, it was hard to shake off the sting of Lisa's harsh words. Tanya hadn't asked for special treatment. She'd only wanted the mistake corrected. But instead, she had been met with an attitude that only made things worse. She felt a twinge of guilt, wondering if she could have handled things differently. But then the memory of Lisa's outbursts and dismissive attitude washed over her again. No, she thought, she didn't deserve that. No one did. As the minutes passed, the plane slowly began to settle into its pre-flight routine again. The flight attendants who had been avoiding the scene before were now quietly moving through the cabin, attending to last-minute details. A few of them smiled at Tanya as they passed, perhaps trying to make her feel more at ease, but it didn't fully lift the weight she felt. She wasn't angry, but she did feel a strange mix of relief and discomfort. Then, the captain's voice came over the intercom, signaling that they were about to begin their taxi to the runway. The flight was moving forward, and soon they would be in the air. But Tanya couldn't shake the feeling that something important had just happened. The way everything had unfolded so quickly seemed like a stark reminder of how a small mistake, something as simple as a seat mix-up, could spiral into a much bigger problem. She couldn't help but wonder how this would play out for Lisa. Would anyone else know the full story? Or would people just remember the fired flight attendant, without ever understanding the tension that had built up over the course of a few short minutes? The plane began its taxi, and Tanya tried to focus on the flight ahead. But as she looked around, she could tell that the incident had left an impression on the other passengers too. The whispers had died down, but there was still a sense of unease in the air. No one seemed quite sure how to process what had just happened, and that made Tanya feel even more unsettled. She was about to let the whole thing go when she heard a soft voice from across the aisle. A woman leaned over and asked, "Are you okay?" "I saw what happened back there," and I just wanted to check on you." Tanya nodded, giving a small smile. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just a little shocked, that's all." The woman smiled back, nodding in understanding. "I get it," she said softly. "It's just crazy how quickly things turned. But honestly, I think you did the right thing. No one should be treated like that." Tanya felt a little lighter hearing that. It was nice to hear someone else acknowledge the situation without judgment. As the plane lifted off, the sky outside growing darker, Tanya found herself reflecting on the unexpected turn of events. A seat mix-up had led to a confrontation that no one could have predicted, and now she was left wondering how Lisa was handling the aftermath. The flight continued on, but for Tanya, the atmosphere on board had changed. It wasn't just the flight attendant being escorted off the plane that lingered in her mind. It was the whole situation. As the plane climbed higher, the noise from the engines filled the cabin, but it couldn't drown out the thoughts swirling in Tanya's head. She had never imagined that a simple seating issue could escalate like that, let alone lead to someone losing their job. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from a friend, asking how her trip was going. Tanya hesitated for a moment before replying. "It's fine, just a crazy thing happened with the flight attendant." She didn't go into details yet. She wasn't sure how to explain what had happened without sounding like she was exaggerating. Besides, the flight wasn't even halfway over, and she wasn't sure if talking about it more would help her process it, or just make it worse. Looking around, Tanya noticed that some of the other passengers were still glancing over at her every now and then. She could tell they were curious, wondering what had happened and why the situation had gotten so out of hand. It was strange, she thought, how quickly word had spread in such a short time. A few minutes earlier, no one had paid any attention to her, but now it felt like she was part of the story. Some passengers were even talking about it. A couple of rows ahead, two women were discussing the incident in low voices, trying not to make it obvious that they were talking about Tanya. "Did you see that? I can't believe she got fired like that. Over a seat? That's intense," one of them whispered. Her companion agreed. "It really wasn't that big of a deal. I don't get why she acted like that, but I guess the airline had no choice, huh?" Tanya felt a wave of discomfort, but also a strange sense of vindication. As much as she didn't want to be the center of attention, part of her knew that Lisa's actions had been completely out of line. Tanya had only asked for help, but the flight attendant had treated her with so much disrespect, as if she were causing trouble when all she wanted was a simple fix. It was a sharp reminder of how customer service should never be about power struggles. It should be about solving problems. She didn't know what had happened after Lisa was escorted off the plane. Had she been escorted to a different flight, or was she left stranded at the airport? What would happen to her career now? Tanya felt a pang of guilt, but then quickly brushed it aside. Lisa had been given plenty of chances to defuse the situation. She could have handled it differently at any point, but she hadn't. And that, Tanya realized, was why things had gone the way they did. As the flight cruised, Tanya started to settle into the rhythm of the trip. She couldn't fully shake the unease, but she also didn't want to let the situation take up more of her mental energy. She'd already dealt with the conflict. Now she just needed to get to Miami and enjoy the rest of her time away from home. But as she thought about Lisa's abrupt departure, Tanya couldn't help but wonder if the story would make headlines. Would the airline be praised for handling it quickly, or would they face backlash for firing someone over such a small issue? It was too early to tell, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this wouldn't be the last time she thought about it. The seatbelt sign flashed on as they neared their destination. Tanya glanced around one more time at the other passengers, many of whom were now relaxing and preparing for landing. But in the back of her mind, she knew this incident would stick with her. Not just because of how it had unfolded, but because it served as a reminder of the power dynamics that existed between passengers and the people who were supposed to help them. And as much as she wanted to forget about it, she knew she wouldn't soon forget the way Lisa had acted, and the way everything had turned around in a matter of minutes. As the plane touched down in Miami, Tanya felt a strange mix of relief and unease. The flight was over, and she was finally able to shake off the tension that had followed her through the entire trip. The wheels hit the runway with a soft thud, and the plane slowly came to a halt at the gate. Passengers began unbuckling their seatbelts, eager to stretch their legs after the flight. But Tanya stayed in her seat for a few moments longer, lost in thought. Her mind kept drifting back to the scene with Lisa, replaying the moments over and over again. It was as if time had slowed down during that confrontation, and now it felt hard to fully escape from it. The announcement for deplaning came over the speaker, snapping Tanya back to the present. She stood up, grabbed her bag, and slowly made her way down the aisle, trying to act like nothing out of the ordinary had happened. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the event had left a mark on the entire flight. Even as she walked toward the exit, she caught snippets of conversations between other passengers. Some were still discussing what had happened. "Can you believe they fired her like that?" one man said to his companion. "Yeah, but I guess she deserved it. She was way out of line," the woman replied. Tanya overheard more of these hushed exchanges as she made her way toward the terminal. It was clear that everyone had an opinion about what had gone down. But it wasn't just the firing that people were focused on. The whole situation, the shouting, the tension, the way it had all unfolded, had caught people's attention. Tanya couldn't help but wonder what Lisa had thought as she walked off the plane. Did she feel embarrassed? Was she already thinking about what her next step would be? Or was she too stunned by the suddenness of her firing to process it all? As Tanya exited the gate and entered the airport terminal, she found herself unable to escape the weight of the situation. The strange sense of relief she'd hoped for didn't fully come. Instead, it felt like she was still caught in the aftermath. She hadn't planned for her trip to start this way. Miami was supposed to be a relaxing break, but now it seemed like the first thing on her mind was what had happened back on the plane. The sudden firing of the flight attendant felt like something out of a drama, and Tanya was right in the middle of it. It wasn't just about Lisa losing her job. It was about how quickly things had turned from a simple seating issue into something that had affected everyone on board. She couldn't shake the thought that there was more to the story that people would never hear. How did Lisa end up in that position? What had her past interactions with passengers been like? Tanya couldn't help but feel there was some backstory to Lisa's behavior. Maybe this wasn't the first time she had been difficult with passengers. Maybe the airline had been watching her for a while. Tanya didn't know, but she began to wonder if Lisa's actions were just the tipping point, the moment the airline could no longer overlook her behavior. As Tanya moved through the crowded terminal, the buzz of people talking, phones ringing, and the general hum of airport life surrounded her. She noticed a few people looking at her, but it didn't feel the same as it had on the plane. No one was whispering about what had happened anymore. It felt like they had moved on, absorbed in their own lives. Tanya took a deep breath, trying to shake off the weight of the last few hours. But there was one thing she knew for sure. This would be a story she would remember for a long time. The thought of Lisa, now out of a job, still lingered in Tanya's mind. It wasn't that she felt sorry for her, but she couldn't ignore the gravity of the situation. Lisa's life was about to change drastically, and the reality of it hit Tanya harder than she expected. A small mistake, a simple misunderstanding could cost someone everything. And while Tanya had ultimately gotten what she wanted, a solution to her seating issue, it had come at a steep price. Lisa might have lost her job, but for Tanya, it was a reminder of how fragile things could be, how easily the balance could tip, and how one moment of frustration could lead to consequences far beyond anyone's control. As Tanya walked through the airport, the weight of the situation finally started to sink in. It wasn't just about what had happened on the plane. It was about the way people's lives could change in an instant, sometimes through no fault of their own. Tanya didn't know what the future held for Lisa, but she did know one thing. It was a powerful reminder to handle situations with care, no matter how small they seemed at the time. The airport was bustling with activity, the sounds of rolling luggage, distant announcements, and travelers chatting filling the air. But Tanya felt as if she were in a bubble. The world around her was moving at its usual pace, but she couldn't escape the thoughts that kept racing through her mind. The whole flight incident felt like it was on repeat, playing over and over again in her head. Lisa's angry outbursts, the shocked faces of the passengers, the swift firing. It all felt like a dream that she couldn't wake up from. Tanya found a quiet spot near the baggage claim area, hoping for a moment to herself. She needed to process everything that had happened, but the more she thought about it, the more questions kept popping up. What had really led to Lisa's outburst? Was this something that had been building for a while? Or had Tanya simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time? Tanya hadn't done anything wrong. She had just asked for help. But the way Lisa had reacted made it feel like Tanya was the one at fault. It was a reminder of how quickly people could lose their composure, especially when they felt challenged in some way. She tried to push the thoughts aside, focusing on the fact that she had finally made it to Miami. She was here to relax, to take a break from the stress of everyday life, and yet the shadow of the incident seemed to follow her every step. Even as she retrieved her suitcase from the conveyor belt, she couldn't stop thinking about Lisa. What would happen to her now? The airline couldn't have fired her without a reason. Was this just a single outburst, or had there been other complaints? Tanya's mind kept wandering back to that heated argument. She had felt so calm, so composed, even when Lisa had been yelling. But now she felt a pang of guilt, wondering if she could have done more to de-escalate the situation. As Tanya walked toward the exit, she checked her phone again. A few missed messages, all unrelated to the flight. But one text caught her eye. It was from her mom. "How's the flight? Everything okay?" Tanya smiled a little, knowing her mom would have checked in with her the moment she landed. Tanya quickly typed back a simple response. "It was fine. A bit of drama on the plane, but it's all good." She didn't want to go into the details just yet. It was too complicated to explain in a text, and she wasn't sure she had the energy to talk about it. Her phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't a message. It was a news alert. Flight attendant fired after heated confrontation over seat assignment. Tanya's stomach dropped. It was the story. The incident she had been a part of was already making headlines. In less than an hour, the airline had already issued a statement, and now people were talking about it all over social media. Tanya clicked on the link, her heart pounding in her chest. The article was brief, outlining the basics of what had happened, how a flight attendant had been fired after a dispute with a passenger over a seating issue. The article mentioned nothing of the details, the shouting, the accusations, or the fact that the other passengers had been recording the incident. It was a basic, sanitized version of the truth, and Tanya couldn't help but feel that something important was missing. She scanned through the comments on the article, looking to see how people were reacting. Most seemed to side with the airline, calling the flight attendant's behavior unprofessional and unacceptable. Some questioned whether she had been given a fair chance to explain herself, but it was clear that the majority of people believed the airline had done the right thing. Tanya's phone buzzed again with another message, but this time it was from one of the passengers on the flight, someone she had briefly spoken to after the incident. "Hey, I just saw the story online. It's crazy how quickly everything happened. Hope you're doing okay after that whole mess." Tanya paused, staring at the message. It felt surreal to think that just a few hours ago, she had been sitting in a plane, trying to resolve a simple seating issue, and now, her experience was the subject of public discussion. It wasn't just the fact that Lisa had been fired, it was the speed with which the whole situation had escalated. One moment, everything was fine, and the next, a career was over. Tanya felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of her felt bad for Lisa, wondering if there was more to her story, more context that wasn't being shared. But then, she remembered how she had been treated, how Lisa had raised her voice and tried to blame her for the issue, and that sympathy started to fade. Tanya's phone buzzed again, this time with a notification from a news outlet. Passenger shares shocking details of flight attendant's outburst. Tanya clicked on it, unsure of what to expect. The article was a bit more detailed. It mentioned the argument, the yelling, the way the other passengers had reacted, and how the airline had acted quickly to resolve the situation. The piece even quoted some of the other passengers, many of whom had described the interaction as uncomfortable, if not downright inappropriate. Tanya felt a wave of relief mixed with guilt. Relief, because it seemed like the truth was finally coming out. Guilt, because she knew that Lisa was the one paying the price for what had happened. She didn't know what the future held for Lisa. The firing had been swift, but Tanya wondered if that would be the end of the story. Would there be protests? Would people come to Lisa's defense, claiming that she had been treated unfairly? Tanya didn't know, but she had a feeling this wasn't the last time she would think about the incident. In some ways, it felt like it was just the beginning, not just for Lisa, but for herself too. For now, Tanya tried to focus on the present. She had made it to Miami, and that was something she could control. But in the back of her mind, the fallout from the flight lingered, and she couldn't help but wonder how it would all play out in the coming days. The next few days in Miami were a blur for Tanya. Despite her best efforts to enjoy her trip, the incident on the plane kept resurfacing in her mind. Every time she looked at her phone, there was a new notification, news stories, social media posts, and updates about the flight attendant who had been fired. It felt like the whole world was talking about it, and Tanya had a hard time shaking the feeling that she was at the center of something much bigger than herself. At first, she had tried to ignore it, focusing on the sights, the food, and the experience of being in a new city. But it wasn't easy. Every time she went online, the headlines seemed to follow her. Flight attendant fired after argument with passenger over seat assignment. Passenger reacts after heated confrontation with flight attendant. Tanya even saw a video that had been posted by one of the other passengers, showing the last moments of the confrontation. It was grainy, shaky, but still clear enough to make Tanya feel exposed. The video had gone viral, and she was now part of a story that was being discussed by thousands, maybe even millions of people. The pressure was starting to get to her. Tanya found herself scrolling through the comments on the various posts, trying to gauge the public's reaction. Some people were sympathetic to her, expressing anger over how the flight attendant had treated her. Others, however, were more focused on the fact that Lisa had lost her job. There were even some who felt the firing was too harsh, arguing that the situation could have been handled with a simple apology and a seat reassignment. Tanya wasn't sure how she felt about it all. The guilt she had been carrying around seemed to grow heavier as the days passed. Yes, Lisa's behavior had been unprofessional, but Tanya still couldn't shake the feeling that things had spiraled out of control too quickly. Was this really the best outcome? Was firing someone really the only option? The more Tanya thought about it, the more complicated it became. She had never wanted to be part of a viral story. She had never wanted to cause someone to lose their job. She had only wanted a simple fix, a seat reassignment, and yet, in a matter of minutes, everything had changed. Tanya's phone buzzed again, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a message from her mom. "I saw the news. Are you okay? You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to, but I'm here for you." Tanya stared at the message for a moment, unsure of what to say. Part of her wanted to talk about it, to unload the weight of everything she had been feeling, but another part of her wanted to push it aside, to move on and leave it behind. She took a deep breath and replied, "I'm okay, just trying to process everything. It's been a lot, honestly." It wasn't much, but it was the truth. Tanya had been trying to push the whole thing out of her mind, but it wasn't working. The story was everywhere, and she couldn't avoid it. For the first time since the flight, Tanya felt a sense of clarity. She wasn't responsible for what had happened. Yes, she had been involved, but the events that led to Lisa being fired were beyond her control. It wasn't her fault that Lisa had escalated things to that point. She had done what anyone would do in her position. She had asked for help, and had tried to remain calm when things went sideways. The more Tanya thought about it, the more she realized that Lisa's actions had consequences. She had crossed a line by yelling at a passenger and refusing to resolve the issue in a professional manner. Tanya wasn't the one who had created the drama. Lisa had. She wasn't responsible for the chain of events that had followed. The guilt that had been eating at her slowly began to dissipate, replaced by a reluctant understanding that sometimes things just spiral out of control. People make mistakes, sometimes big ones, and those mistakes can change everything in an instant. Tanya didn't have the power to fix that, nor did she have control over how the situation unfolded. It was a difficult realization, but it was also a freeing one. Tanya started to think about the bigger picture. She knew she would eventually have to confront the situation again when she returned home. Her friends and family would undoubtedly want to hear the full story, and there would probably be questions. She wasn't looking forward to reliving it all, but she knew that eventually she'd have to share what had happened. What she couldn't shake, though, was the deeper lesson the whole incident had left her with. People in customer service, like flight attendants, are under a lot of pressure. One bad moment, one outburst, can cost them everything. And Tanya couldn't help but wonder if there were other flight attendants out there who had made similar mistakes, who had been lucky enough to avoid the public spotlight. The more Tanya thought about Lisa's firing, the more she realized how quickly things had gone from a minor inconvenience to a career-ending event. It wasn't just about the seating issue. It was about how people handle conflict. Tanya had stayed calm throughout the entire ordeal, trying to defuse the situation. But the way Lisa had reacted was the catalyst that set everything in motion. Lisa had been the one to escalate things, and now she was paying the price for her actions. Tanya knew that the firing was probably the right move, given the severity of the situation, but she couldn't help but feel that something larger was at play here. How many other people, in similar situations, had been let go for moments of anger or poor judgment? How many small mistakes had been blown out of proportion? Tanya spent the rest of the day wandering through the city, trying to clear her head. She still had a few days left in Miami, and she didn't want the weight of the incident to overshadow her trip. But as she walked along the beach, the sound of the waves crashing against the shore, Tanya realized that she was still trying to make sense of everything. It wasn't just about the flight. It was about the way people are treated, the way service workers are expected to remain calm in situations that would frustrate anyone. And more than that, it was about the consequences of a single moment, a moment that could change everything in the blink of an eye. By the time Tanya's trip in Miami was winding down, she had come to a conclusion, albeit an uneasy one. She knew that, in a way, she would never fully leave the flight incident behind. The story would follow her, probably longer than she was comfortable with, but she also realized there were deeper lessons in what had happened. As much as she had wanted to escape the media frenzy, it had forced her to think critically about the situation in ways she hadn't before. What started out as a small seating issue had transformed into a situation that would affect not just her, but an entire community of passengers, a flight crew, and a public audience that had quickly become involved. As Tanya sat on the balcony of her hotel room, looking out over the Miami skyline, the reality of the situation began to hit her. What had seemed like a fleeting moment of chaos on the plane now felt like a significant event that might change the way she viewed customer service, conflict, and personal responsibility. Tanya had grown up with a healthy respect for people who worked in customer service. Her mother had always taught her to treat others with kindness, especially those who worked in jobs that required constant interaction with the public. But the more she thought about the interaction with Lisa, the more she realized how much pressure these workers were under. The pressure to be polite and professional no matter the circumstances. The pressure to remain calm when people were rude, impatient, or, like in this case, simply in the wrong. The incident with Lisa had shown Tanya the reality of what could happen when that pressure boiled over. It wasn't just about one flight attendant's outburst. It was about a system that put people in high-stress jobs without always providing the tools or support they needed to handle conflicts. It wasn't hard to imagine that Lisa, over time, had dealt with difficult passengers and had probably become frustrated with the repetitive nature of her job. But none of that excused the way she had handled things with Tanya. When the argument started, Lisa could have taken a breath, reassessed the situation, and handled it calmly. Instead, she had let her emotions get the better of her, and in the span of just a few minutes, her career was over. Tanya began to feel a sort of empathy for Lisa, not because of the way she'd treated her, but because of how quickly things had escalated. Tanya couldn't ignore that Lisa had made a choice to engage in the confrontation, and yet, Tanya was coming to understand how easily a small issue, like a seating error, could spiral into something larger. If Lisa had taken a more measured approach, if she had simply acknowledged the mistake and moved on, maybe it wouldn't have ended the way it did. But the reality was that emotions and pride had gotten in the way of a simple solution. It struck Tanya that Lisa wasn't the only one affected. The entire flight had been disrupted by the argument. Passengers had witnessed the outburst, some of them recording it on their phones. That video had gone viral, and in a matter of hours, people from all over the world had formed opinions. Tanya's own actions were scrutinized as well, even though she had remained calm throughout the ordeal. Some people admired her composure. Others saw her as someone who had allowed the situation to unfold. But no matter how she looked at it, Tanya couldn't escape the feeling that her experience had become something bigger than she could have ever anticipated. The moment was no longer about her seat. It was about the fallout, the consequences, and how people would react when they saw the story unfold. Tanya was starting to realize that there were no real winners in this situation. Yes, Lisa had been fired and Tanya had gotten a seat reassignment, but the aftermath of the incident left both sides with scars. Tanya's phone had been buzzing non-stop with messages from friends and family, all asking for more details. What happened on the flight? Are you okay? Is Lisa okay? Tanya didn't know how to respond. Part of her wanted to explain everything, but she realized that no matter what she said, it would never fully capture the complexity of the situation. People would form their opinions, and that would be the narrative. Tanya thought back to the news stories and social media posts that had taken over her feed. The sensational headlines, the comments, the debates. It was all part of a cycle that had little to do with the truth and everything to do with perception. The media was quick to report the firing, to discuss the drama, but no one was talking about the underlying issues, like the way customer service workers were treated, or the stress they faced on a daily basis. The focus had been on the surface-level conflict, and the real story had been lost in the noise. She found herself reflecting on the bigger picture. In a society driven by constant connectivity and instant reactions, people were quick to judge, quick to assign blame, and quick to forget. Tanya had learned that the world didn't always care about nuance or context. What mattered was the moment, the headline, the spectacle. Lisa had been a part of that spectacle, and Tanya had been swept up in it too, whether she liked it or not. And yet Tanya also knew that there were lessons to be learned from all of this. The importance of staying calm under pressure, the impact of words and actions, and the unpredictable ways in which things could spiral out of control. As Tanya spent her last day in Miami, she decided to take some time for herself, to really think about what she had learned. She wasn't sure if she'd ever fully understand why things had unfolded the way they did, but she knew one thing. She didn't want to be part of that cycle again. The cycle of judgment, reaction, and consequence that had made the entire situation feel like a public spectacle. She didn't want to be caught up in the drama of it all, and she didn't want to let the noise of the world drown out the things that truly mattered. Tanya had hoped for a relaxing vacation, but what she had gotten instead was a life lesson about conflict, empathy, and the consequences of a single moment. As she boarded her return flight home, she resolved to move forward. She couldn't change what had happened, but she could take the lessons with her. And maybe, just maybe, she could help make the world a little quieter, a little more understanding for the next person who found themselves caught in the middle of an argument that was never really about them in the first place. By the time Tanya boarded her return flight back home, a deep sense of reflection had settled over her. As much as she wanted to put the whole incident behind her, she knew it had changed her in ways she hadn't fully realized yet. The events of that flight, the argument, the firing, the media frenzy, had left an imprint on her. something that couldn't be erased just because she was leaving Miami. The feeling of being thrust into a situation she never asked for, one that became public and viral in the blink of an eye, lingered in the back of her mind. She wasn't just a passenger anymore. She had been part of a story, a headline. But what did that really mean? As she sat down in her seat and fastened her seatbelt, Tanya stared out the window, trying to shake off the feeling that something larger was at play. The air was still, and the hum of the plane's engines was the only sound that seemed to make any sense. It was strange how a simple event, a small misunderstanding between a passenger and a flight attendant, could unravel so quickly and have such wide-reaching consequences. In a matter of hours, Tanya had gone from someone who just wanted to fix a minor issue to a person at the center of a viral storm. The story was no longer about the seat mix-up. It had become about conflict, authority, and what happened when things went wrong. Tanya had come to realize that the media, the public, and even the other passengers on the flight all saw the situation through their own lens, shaped by their own biases and assumptions. What was even more troubling to Tanya was the fact that the story had been simplified in the eyes of many. The headlines were brief: flight attendant fired after argument with passenger. To the general public, it might seem like a straightforward case. An unruly employee, a patient passenger, a quick resolution. But Tanya knew that the truth wasn't so simple. There were so many nuances that had been left out. The pressure on the flight attendant, the power dynamics between passengers and crew, the way stress could build up in the most unexpected ways. No one in the media cared about the back and forth that led to Lisa's outburst, or the internal struggles that passengers like Tanya sometimes faced when trying to navigate these situations with respect and patience. Tanya found herself wondering, did Lisa deserve to be fired so quickly? She wasn't condoning Lisa's behavior, not by any means, but she couldn't help but think that there had to be more to her story. People made mistakes. They got overwhelmed. But did that mean their livelihoods should be on the line for one poor decision? Tanya knew she wasn't the only one wondering this. On social media, some people had supported Lisa, saying that she'd been driven to the edge by the demanding nature of her job. Others believed the firing was necessary, that no one should get away with treating a customer that way. The debate was ongoing, with people divided. But Tanya, now more than ever, felt that the issue wasn't as black and white as it seemed. As the plane took off, Tanya's thoughts wandered to the broader picture, the way society so often reacted with immediate judgment, looking for a villain and a victim, without considering the complexities of the situation. In a way, the entire experience had shown Tanya how easy it was to be swept into a narrative that didn't necessarily reflect the full truth. Lisa had been painted as the villain, and Tanya had been thrust into the role of the victim, both of them reduced to their actions, nothing more. But what about the pressures that led to those actions? What about the real human emotions that had been involved? Tanya didn't know if it was possible for anyone to understand all the layers of the situation without living through it. The flight attendants on this return flight were friendly and efficient, doing their jobs with a calm professionalism that Tanya appreciated. She noticed how different this experience felt compared to the last one. There was no tension in the air, no heated arguments or misplaced aggression. Tanya couldn't help but think about how different things might have been if Lisa had handled her part of the job with the same calmness. How much of the tension in the cabin could have been avoided if people just took a step back, recognized that things don't always go perfectly, and worked together to fix them. As the plane soared higher, the city of Miami fading into the distance, Tanya's mind shifted toward the bigger questions. What role did she play in all of this? She had asked for a seat change, and she had been calm and polite throughout the ordeal. But what would have happened if she had reacted differently? What if she had yelled too? Would that have made Lisa's outburst seem less extreme? Or had she, in some way, helped keep things from escalating by remaining composed? Tanya didn't know. She wasn't sure she wanted to know. But the thought lingered, gnawing at her. More than anything, Tanya began to understand that there was no easy answer to this. The world wanted everything to fit into neat boxes. clear-cut stories with defined roles. But real life wasn't like that. People were complicated, and their actions often had many layers. What seemed like an act of rudeness or aggression could sometimes be the result of stress, exhaustion, or unmet needs. And what appeared to be a simple mistake, like a seat assignment error, could unravel in ways that no one expected. Tanya had learned that she could never know the full story behind anyone else's actions, just as no one could ever know the full story behind hers. As she drifted in and out of sleep during the flight, Tanya found herself thinking more about how people often handled conflict, both in public and private. It was easy to let emotions take over in moments of frustration. It was easy to make quick judgments based on a single interaction. But life didn't always work that way. People made mistakes. They got frustrated. They acted out of stress. It was important to remember that, before jumping to conclusions about others, before condemning someone based on a single moment, there was always more going on behind the scenes. By the time the plane began its descent back home, Tanya had come to a realization. She couldn't change what had happened, nor could she undo the way the situation had spiraled. Lisa's fate had already been sealed. The public had already made up their minds. But Tanya, for her part, was determined to take away something positive from the experience. She wasn't going to let the noise of the world dictate how she saw the situation. She wasn't going to let the headlines, the social media posts, or the opinions of others define the truth. She had seen a glimpse into the complexities of human behavior, and that was a lesson she could carry with her. Tanya gathered her things as the plane landed, the wheels touching down with a soft thud. As she stood up to leave, she felt a sense of closure, albeit a reluctant one. It wasn't about right or wrong anymore. It was about understanding that things were rarely as simple as they appeared. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all. When Tanya finally stepped off the plane and made her way through the terminal, the sense of relief was overwhelming. She had made it back home, but there was still a weight on her shoulders, one that had been there for days. The whole experience, from the initial seat mix-up to the viral storm that followed, had left her with a deep, unsettling feeling that wasn't going away. The news stories, the comments, the endless debates, it all felt so distant now, yet it was still there, just beneath the surface. Even as she walked through the bustling airport surrounded by the usual crowds of travelers, Tanya couldn't shake the sense of being watched, scrutinized, as if her every move was being analyzed. She tried to keep her thoughts in check, but they kept drifting back to Lisa. Tanya couldn't help but wonder about the aftermath. Had Lisa found another job yet? Was she at home, scrolling through the same headlines Tanya had seen, reading the comments, hearing the judgment? Tanya could only imagine the embarrassment and frustration Lisa must have felt. Even though Tanya had no personal ill will toward her, the public spectacle made it hard to ignore the human cost of the incident. Lisa had been fired, and for what? A simple mistake that spiraled out of control. Was that fair? Tanya didn't know. There was no manual for these kinds of situations, no easy answers, just a mess of emotions, perspectives, and consequences. As Tanya made her way to the baggage claim area, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from her closest friend, Mia. "Saw the story online. Are you okay? I know it's been a lot. Don't let all the noise get to you." Tanya stared at the screen for a moment, unsure of how to respond. Mia had been her sounding board throughout the trip, the one person she could confide in about her frustrations. Tanya typed back quickly, "It's been overwhelming. I'm okay though, just trying to figure out how to process everything." It wasn't the whole truth, but it was close enough. The reality was that Tanya wasn't sure if she'd ever fully process what had happened, or what it meant about the world, and the way people reacted to conflict. Tanya's mind kept racing as she grabbed her suitcase from the conveyor belt. The whole situation had made her think more deeply about human behavior, conflict resolution, and how easily things could go wrong when people let their emotions dictate their actions. It wasn't just Lisa's outburst that had caused the problem. It was the build-up, the frustration, the pressures that everyone involved had been carrying. Tanya had been calm throughout the incident, but she knew that wasn't always the case for others. People didn't always respond rationally when they felt threatened, belittled, or disrespected. And the truth was, she had been lucky. Her response to the situation had been composed, but many others might not have been able to stay as calm under the same pressure. The more Tanya thought about it, the more she realized how often conflicts, whether in customer service, at work, or even within families, were handled poorly because people didn't take the time to understand each other's perspective. Everyone had their own story, their own set of challenges, but those stories were rarely communicated in moments of stress. When emotions ran high, all that mattered was being right, winning the argument, or getting the immediate satisfaction of feeling in control. Tanya had seen that dynamic play out with Lisa. In the moment, it wasn't about the seat or even the mistake. It was about the way the two of them had clashed over something that should have been simple. A mistake had been made, but instead of trying to fix it together, Lisa had let her frustration guide her actions. Tanya couldn't help but think about how many times she'd been in situations where communication had broken down, where she herself had been quick to react, or where someone else had made a snap judgment that had led to unnecessary conflict. It wasn't that she believed people should be passive or tolerate bad treatment. Far from it. But the lesson she had learned in Miami was that sometimes, stepping back and pausing before reacting could make all the difference. In those moments when everything seemed to be spinning out of control, taking a breath and considering the other person's perspective could prevent a lot of damage. By the time Tanya left the airport and got into her car, she had already made a mental note to talk to Mia about everything when she got home. Mia had always been the person who helped her process tough situations, who helped her see beyond her immediate emotions and figure out what truly mattered. Tanya needed that right now. She needed someone to help her sort through all the conflicting feelings swirling inside her. She knew she wasn't the only one who had been impacted by the flight incident. Lisa's career had been affected, and Tanya's reputation had been drawn into question, whether she liked it or not. But Tanya also understood that the real impact wasn't in the headlines. It was in the way people viewed each other. The way conflict could explode without warning and how easily it could all be avoided with a little more patience, empathy, and understanding. The drive back home felt longer than usual, the familiar streets passing by in a blur as Tanya's thoughts ran wild. What if there was a better way to handle things? What if she had been able to talk to Lisa before it had gotten so heated? What if she had asked a different question, used a softer tone, or found a different way to approach the situation? But those questions were irrelevant now. The moment had passed, and nothing she could have done would change what had happened. The reality was, this was a lesson in the unpredictability of human interaction, in how quickly emotions could spiral out of control when people weren't prepared to handle the pressure. When Tanya finally got home, she felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and clarity. The weight of the past few days didn't vanish with her return, but something inside her had shifted. She had gained a new perspective, not just on the events of the flight, but on how she viewed conflict, responsibility, and human interactions in general. As she sat down in her living room and scrolled through her phone one last time, she couldn't help but feel a sense of resolution. The story of the flight attendant's outburst and her subsequent firing would continue to circulate, but Tanya had learned that it was more than just a story. It was a reflection of how easily things could escalate, how the world could turn something small into something much bigger, and how important it was to try to maintain control in moments of stress. Tanya wasn't sure how the story would unfold for Lisa, or if there would be any further fallout. But she knew that for her, the lesson was clear. She couldn't control the way things unfolded, but she could control how she responded. And as she sat there in her living room, finally able to unwind after a long and difficult week, Tanya realized that the most important thing was not just how she reacted in moments of conflict, but how she carried those lessons forward into every conversation, every disagreement, and every encounter in her life moving forward. As the days passed, Tanya began to settle back into her routine, but the weight of the recent events still lingered. Her mind would often drift back to the flight, to Lisa, and to how everything had unfolded so quickly. It wasn't just the incident that had been difficult to process, but the aftermath, the way it had affected not just her, but everyone involved. She couldn't help but think about how easily things could have gone differently. If Lisa had just remained calm, or if Tanya had handled the situation in another way, would things have played out the same? Would Lisa still have her job? Would the viral video have ever been shared? The questions didn't stop, but Tanya knew she couldn't keep turning them over in her mind. She had to let go of what she couldn't change. Still, every now and then, she would see something, a headline, a tweet, or even a passing comment in a conversation, and it would bring her back to that moment on the plane. It was like she was trapped in a loop, the memory replaying in her mind, refusing to let her forget. She could tell that people around her were still talking about it too, though not as directly as before. Her co-workers mentioned it in passing, as if it were just another piece of gossip. Friends too would ask her about it, checking in to make sure she was okay after everything had gone down. The pressure of it all started to wear on her, and she began to realize that no matter how much she wanted to forget, the public nature of the incident meant it would follow her for a while. One afternoon, as Tanya sat in her favorite coffee shop sipping on a latte, she overheard a conversation at a nearby table. Two women were discussing the viral video that had been circulating. "Did you hear about that flight attendant? She got fired after yelling at a passenger over a seat." "That's crazy," one of them said. The other woman nodded. "Yeah, I saw the video. People are calling it unprofessional, but I don't know. I think the passenger might have been a little too quick to escalate things. It didn't seem like a big deal to me." Tanya felt a familiar knot in her stomach. It wasn't the first time she had overheard something like this, and it probably wouldn't be the last. People had their opinions, and as much as she wanted to ignore it, she couldn't escape the fact that she was a part of that story now. The narrative was still unfolding, but it felt like she was on the sidelines, watching as her role in the situation was discussed, analyzed, and often misunderstood. It was a strange feeling, being part of something so public, yet feeling so removed from the way others saw it. The more Tanya thought about it, the more she realized that the incident was not just about Lisa or herself anymore. It was about how people viewed conflict, how quickly they judged situations without knowing the full story, and how easy it was to fall into the trap of public opinion. People were quick to form opinions based on what they saw in the moment, on the video, on the headlines, and they rarely considered the complexity of the situation. Tanya wasn't innocent, but she wasn't guilty either. She had asked for a seat change, tried to stay calm, and didn't escalate things. But in the court of public opinion, things were always more black and white than they were in reality. What bothered Tanya the most, though, wasn't the fact that the situation had been taken out of context. It was how people's opinions seemed to change so easily. One minute, she was the victim of an angry outburst. The next, some people were questioning whether she had overreacted. It was as if the moment you were part of a story like this, you were no longer a person. You were just a character, subject to whatever narrative the public chose to believe. The next few days were filled with moments of reflection. Tanya spent more time thinking about how quickly opinions were formed, how people rarely saw beyond the surface of a situation. But there was a deeper, quieter realization that had started to settle in her mind. She didn't need to be defined by what had happened on that plane. Lisa's outburst, the firing, the viral video, none of it defined her. She wasn't going to let a single incident, no matter how public, determine her future, her reputation, or her sense of self. Tanya knew she had to move forward. The story would eventually die down, the headlines would fade, and the internet would move on to the next viral sensation. But the lessons she had learned about empathy, communication, and the complexity of human behavior would stick with her. What had happened on the plane wasn't just a random event. It was a reminder of how easily things could escalate, and how important it was to stop and think before reacting. Tanya had learned that sometimes it was okay to step back and let things unfold on their own. She didn't have to control everything, and she certainly didn't have to fit into the role others had assigned her. As the weeks went by, Tanya found herself reflecting less and less on the flight. The noise from the media and the constant chatter around her slowly faded into the background. People moved on, and so did she. She went back to her daily life, focusing on work, on spending time with friends, on the things that truly mattered. And yet, every now and then, when she heard someone talk about the incident, or when she saw a reminder of it online, she would pause. The memory would resurface and she would remember, but now it didn't feel like something that defined her. It was just a chapter, an important one, yes, but just one chapter in a much bigger story. Months passed, and the flight incident slowly faded into the background of Tanya's life. She'd heard whispers of the story from time to time, but by then, it had become just another viral incident people had moved on from. Tanya had found peace with it, not because she had fully forgotten what had happened, but because she had come to terms with the way things had played out. Life had continued, and so had she. It wasn't that the event didn't matter, but she had learned to let go of the weight it had carried in those first few weeks after her return. One evening, as Tanya sat with Mia in their favorite restaurant, enjoying a quiet dinner, the conversation turned to something lighter. They were talking about their plans for the summer when Mia suddenly brought it up. "You know," she said casually, "I was reading the other day about that flight attendant incident. That whole thing got so much attention, didn't it? It's still kind of crazy to think about how fast it all went down." Tanya's heart skipped for a moment, but she kept her composure. She'd expected this. People who would still remember or bring it up from time to time. It had been a big story after all, but now it didn't bother her as much as it once did. She shrugged and smiled. "Yeah, it was wild. But honestly, I don't think about it much anymore." Her voice was steady, almost as if she were speaking about someone else's story. And in a way, that's exactly what it felt like now. Mia looked at her with a knowing glance. "You handled it well, though. I remember how much that shook you at first, but it seems like you've really moved past it. I mean, it could have been a lot worse." Tanya nodded, grateful for her friend's words. "I think the whole thing just made me realize how much people react without knowing the full story. You never really know what someone's going through, you know. And sometimes things spiral out of control faster than you can even process." Mia gave a soft laugh. "Sounds like you've learned a lot from it." "I have," Tanya said. "But I think what I learned most is that it's important not to get caught up in what other people think. I can't control their reactions or what they decide to believe. I can only control how I handle it. I think that's what's kept me sane through all of it." The conversation shifted, and Tanya could tell that Mia respected her for finding a place of peace with it. For a while, it had felt like she was stuck in the middle of a storm, unable to see the way out. But now that storm felt like a distant memory. She had learned so much about herself, about conflict, and about how fleeting public attention could be. The world moved quickly. People would remember the story for a while, but eventually the headlines would change, and new events would take their place. Tanya's phone buzzed at the table, pulling her attention away. It was a notification from the news app she had never fully stopped using, even if she rarely checked it. The headline read, "Flight attendants firing leads to calls for better support systems in customer service jobs." Tanya clicked on the article, intrigued. It was an opinion piece discussing how many service workers, particularly flight attendants, faced extreme pressure in their roles, and how that sometimes led to explosive incidents. The article highlighted the need for better mental health resources, training on handling stress, and improved customer service structures within airlines. Tanya took a moment to read through it. For the first time, she felt a little more clarity about the whole situation. The piece echoed a lot of the thoughts she'd had, but hadn't fully articulated during the chaos of the incident. It wasn't just about one flight attendant or one passenger. It was about an entire system. A culture where pressure, stress, and expectations collided. Reading it, Tanya felt a sense of vindication, not for herself, but for everyone who had ever been caught in similar situations, whether as a service worker or as a customer. When she finished reading, she looked up at Mia. "You know," she said, a small smile forming on her lips, "I think it's good that there's more conversation about this stuff now. About how much pressure people in customer service are under. Maybe something will change for the better." Mia nodded. "It's about time, don't you think? You can't just expect people to handle all that stress without it affecting them eventually." Tanya leaned back in her chair, feeling a quiet sense of resolution. The incident had sparked a conversation that Tanya had never expected to be a part of, but maybe that was the most important thing that had come out of it. Sometimes things had to get messy before change could happen. And though she had felt the weight of the public judgment, the personal discomfort, and the emotional toll, Tanya had come to see it as a catalyst for something bigger. Maybe Lisa's firing hadn't been ideal, and maybe the media had spun the story out of control, but at least there was now a growing awareness of the pressure service workers faced. At least people were talking about it. As Tanya left the restaurant that night, the cool air of the evening wrapping around her, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced before. She had moved on, not because the incident was insignificant, but because she had found a way to move forward. The situation had been difficult, and the journey to understanding had been long. But Tanya had learned that some things in life couldn't be controlled or predicted. What mattered now was how she moved through it, what she took with her, and how she allowed it to shape the way she saw the world. In the end, it wasn't about the public spectacle or the judgment of others. It was about what she chose to take from it. And for Tanya, that meant finding clarity, empathy, and a deeper understanding of human interactions, and using that to move forward with a little more peace, a little more patience, and a lot more awareness. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more videos like this.